Hey film fans, what's up? Since the beginning of cinema, movies have been depicting love in all types of varieties and in all types of situations. Looking for love, finding love, losing love, regaining love. You have romantic love, erotic love, you have parental love, you have brotherly or sisterly love, the love of friends, and so on. But to call your film love, not lost loves or what's love got to do with it, or will I ever find love again, but just love? Hopefully you've got the film to back it up. Let's find out on this episode of What Makes This Film Great. Hey everybody, before I get into the film itself, I just wanted to ask you all a couple questions. You might notice that this is the third Hungarian film in a row we've done in this series, and I wanted to ask you two things. First of all, do you like the idea of me doing sort of these mini units or mini arcs, like 3 or 4 or 5 films about the same kind of topic, broad topic? It could be genre, it could be director or cinematographer, it could be era, whatever. If you'd like to see more of that, these sort of mini series, let me know in the comments. Also, and related to that, in my introduction to this new YouTube series that I've been doing, I mentioned that I'd be doing non-English language films, but not the sort of biggies like the French New Wave or New German Cinema or Kurosawa or Ozu or something like that. Are there other countries' filmography that you'd like to see me explore? If yes to either of those questions, just let me know in the comments, and I can't promise anything because it depends if I can find the films, but if it sparks an interest on my part, I'll try to follow it up. Love is a 1971 film directed by Károly Mach. Mach is one of the great Hungarian directors of the second half of the 20th century. In fact, he only just died a few years ago in 2017. And if you watch Love and you're interested, a few of his other films you might want to check out are Liliomfi, Another Way, which is a great film about secret police and lesbian love in the time of communism in Hungary. And then another film I'll mention towards the end of this video, A Long Weekend in Pest and Buda, which he did in 2003. The film's script was written by Péter Bacsa, who people in Hungary will know as the director of the film The Witness, which is a really great political satire from the late 60s. And it was based on the short stories of a Hungarian writer named Tibor Déry. In fact, it's based on 2 separate stories, and Mach was an admirer of Déry, and he believed that he could kind of stitch these 2 stories together, which he did with Bacsa's help. And that's why it feels almost like 2 different films. A first kind of long film and a second shorter but related film. The film stars some heavy hitters of Hungarian cinema talent. Nagymama, the mother-in-law, who's never named in the film, is played by Lili Darvas, who was a famous actor of the stage before she started acting in Hungarian cinema. The daughter-in-law, Luca, kind of the star of the film, or arguably the protagonist, is portrayed by Mari Töröcsik, and she's one of the great performers of the last 60 years from any country, and I highly recommend that you check out her body of work. It also stars Ivan Darvas and Erzsi Orsolya, who often doesn't get mentioned in discussion of this film. She plays the housekeeper, but she's fantastic, and so I wanted to mention her as well. Like the previous 2 Hungarian films that have been subject of What Makes This Film Great, Love is a historical allegory, although the time between when it's set and when it's made is much shorter. Love was filmed in the early 70s, and it's about the early 1950s. So we're talking about actual living memory, not just like your grandparents' memory, but the people who made the film lived through the time period in which the film is set. In fact, Ivan Darvas, who plays János, was imprisoned for almost 2 years after the 1956 revolution in Hungary. So it's not just living memory for him, but to a certain extent, it's lived experience. So it's set in the early 50s, and the narrative's quite simple, really. János is in prison. János is missing for much of the film, and he's been imprisoned, we don't know exactly why, but for politics, we're told. His wife, Luca, is living alone now. She's working, but her main task seems to be to take care of his aged and mostly bedridden mother-in-law, Nagymama, played by Lily Darvash. So Nagymama lives with the maid, Irene, and Irene cooks the food, cleans the house, kind of takes care of her daily needs, whereas Lutza comes and visits once a day. She brings flowers, she brings little gifts. There's a ritual to this, and later in the film, when her financial circumstances become more dire, she has to find ways to appear to bring the flowers without actually having to go out and buy flowers. So Nagymama spends most of her time in the film in bed, and it seems dire. Her health is grim, and her memory is starting to go. And what Lutza does is come to comfort her, to talk with her. There's an antagonism there. Both Lutza and Irene seem to believe that Nagymama's demands are tiresome. She is starting to get a little senile. She forgets what she's asked for. She'll ring the bell to call them in and then forget why she called them in. It's hard. This is in the early 50s in Hungary. Life itself is a struggle. It's a totalitarian regime that's, its tentacles are growing and reaching further and further. There's a fear about everybody's actions, and that pressure is on Lutza particularly because her husband is a political prisoner. But she does her duty, and there are moments in the film where it doesn't seem like it's just a duty.
Sokáig nem tetszik ezt már bírni. Egy nyavaját. Hát 10 évig már nem. Egy évet már leült, már csak 90 hátra. Azt meg már nem éri meg az öreg nagyságos asszony. Hát azt nem. De addig legyen meg mindene. Hetényi professzor úr megígérte neki, hogy 100 évig fog élni. Jöjjön csak ide, Irénke. Nézd csak, milyen jó fazonja van az arcának.
And this is where this idea of love comes in. What kind of love is this film about? Lutza loves János. She pines for his return. Nagymama loves János. He's her son. She also pines for his return. János is in prison and she's dying. So all she wants is to see her son again. And then the third one is this delicate love, which is the one we mostly see on screen between Lutza and Nagymama. These two women who both fiercely love János, but they can't give that love to him because he's gone. And so they have to give it to each other, although they don't always approve of each other. They do take care of each other. The way that Lutza takes care of Nagymama is the heart of the film. Nagymama doesn't know that János is in prison. She believes that he's in America making a film, starting his film career. And the reason she believes this is because Lutza secretly writes letters to Nagymama from János from America. So Lutza has decided it's her job to comfort Nagymama in her dying days by giving her some pride in her son, rather than to worry her about her son being a political prisoner. And while the film is about love, it's also about loss and that delicate intertwining of love and loss. And Lutza is the character whose losses are manifest throughout the film. At the beginning of the film, they've both lost János. But throughout the course of the film, Lutza also loses her job. She loses her flat to a certain extent. The authorities decide that a flat which she once lived in with János is too big for one person, so they move another couple in. So she loses her privacy. Eventually, she starts to lose her friends as well, who shy away from her because of the taint of János's imprisonment. So throughout the film, Lutza's perseverance, her insistence on continuing to take care of Nagymama, to hope against all odds that János might one day return, is cast against the backdrop of her continual loss throughout the film. There's a lot that makes this film work. Not a lot happens really, but a lot happens. And part of that's down to the performances, and the performances are incredible. There are long scenes between Lutza and Nagymama, where they're in Nagymama's bedroom and Nagymama's in bed and they're arguing, then they're laughing, they're loving each other, then they're angry at each other. And these performances between Darvash and Töröcsik are just so compelling and so fascinating to watch because they both bring a depth of emotion, and they're not just, it's not love, it's not sappy, there's anger, and that anger turns quickly to humor, dark humor, but then laughter. The performances are incredibly compelling, and it's worth watching the film for those alone. There's a great sequence when Lutza comes and she asks Nagymama to tell her a story about when János and his brother were little. And Nagymama doesn't want to tell his story. She's like, oh, I've told you this story. I've told you before. I've told you a million times. And Lutza just wants to hear it. And she has to kind of push her and cajole her and start the story a little bit for her and let Nagymama finish.
Nagyon régen. Talán 40 éve megvan. Akkor még egész fiatal asszony lehetett a mama, amikor savanyok úton jártak. Akkor én voltam 36? Olyasféle. Na, hogy is volt azzal a leselkedése? Az úgy volt, de azt én magának már elmeséltem. De ha egyszer nem emlékszem jól, csak arra emlékszem, hogy este volt, a gyerekek már ágyban feküdtek, és a mama le akart vetközni. Szép asszony lehetett a mama. Igen, nagyon szép voltam.
What you start to realize is they both know this story intimately, but this is one of the ways that they keep János's memory alive. And throughout that sequence, there's pushing, there's pulling, there's resistance, and then there's a coming together. And we, the audience, feel like we're getting to know not only these two women better, but János throughout this performance, this really compelling performance between the two. But what I want to talk about for sort of the rest of this video today is two elements of the film that really deepen and enrich the narrative. One is a sort of formalistic thing, which is the editing, and another is its approach to narrative. You could describe this film as depicting a kind of unsentimental realism. The cinematography, the mise-en-scène of the production design, the costumes, the props are stark, and the performances are the same. Lutza, as much as we might admire her, she's not angelic. She can be cruel, she can get cross, she can be mean to Nagymama, and vice versa. And so there's this sense of this kind of stark reality of the early 50s in Hungary. And for the most part, the editing of the film follows that sort of realist approach. It's typical continuity editing, lots of long takes, not extreme long takes, but long takes where we follow the characters through this world. And it's kind of, in a way, typical of mid-century European realism in that way. But throughout the film, there are flashes of a more expressionistic approach to the editing. And I want to start with a really small example and then look at a little bit longer one to kind of show you what I mean by this expressionist editing. What you may or may not have noticed is that as she gets up out of bed, she's wearing her glasses, and when we cut to the shot outside the window, her glasses are not on her face. It just could be a matter of the fact that as she was walking, she decided to take the glasses off, or it could be a continuity error. I think this is a conscious decision in the editing to create a very small, very subtle moment of unsettling. The viewer doesn't necessarily notice that she's taken her glasses off, but perhaps the subconscious mind notices. So there's a little bit of discomfort there because it doesn't quite seem right that there the glasses would be and there they're not. This is a formal way that the film tries to convey the unsettling environment in which these two women live. One of the things the film focuses on a lot, although again kind of in the background, is the passage of time. They talk about the seasons, right? When we start the film, there's snow on the ground. We see characters' breath when they're outside. We hear discussion later of a sort of dismal, rainy spring. And by the end of the film, it seems like it's in summer. But have 6 months passed or have 18 months passed? We don't necessarily know. So there's this kind of insistence on the passage of time, but also a playfulness around how much time has actually passed. And this is a kind of confusion. This is a kind of mild instability that I think is meant to mirror the instability in their lives. And so these editing decisions, and this is not the only one, there are several throughout the film where it looks like continuity editing, but there's something off. It looks seamless, but the geography of it doesn't make sense. And in this sense, the formalism of the editing is, on occasion, not throughout the film, on occasion, more expressive than the kind of stark realism of the cinematography and the mise-en-scène. This is more dramatically so in the flashback scenes or the memory scenes. Most of the memory flashback scenes are nudge moments, although we get a few smaller ones from Lutza as well. And they're done in this kind of artificial, clearly fake way. So she doesn't have the flashback where there's a dissolve and then we see her as a youth or see her mothering her children. We get cuts of still shots, some of them with live actors, some of them are pages from books. When she's reading the letter with the magnifying glass, some of the cuts look like we're seeing them through a magnifying glass. So it's all meant to imply that these are flashes of memory. And I want to show you a kind of longish scene. I won't show the whole thing, just so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. And this is the one big letter reading scene in the film.
Tessék ideadni a nagyító üvegérén. Rövid levelét, igaz, hogy most még kevesebb időn van, mert rövidesen kitűzik a film bemutatója New York legnagyobb filmszínházába, melyben egyszerűen 30 000 ember fér el. Most épül a város közelében 2000 méter magas tetején, és bemutatóig el kell készülni, mert az én filmemmel akarnak nyitni. Tetejéről Fél-Amerikát belátni egészen a Kordellerikig, és az Andeszekig. Nem szól az Atlanti-óceánról. Filmszínháznak persze külön repülőtere lesz, mert a gazdag emberek egész Amerikába saját repülőgépen járnak majd itt. Mama tudja, hogy eddig a Waldorf Astoriában, New York legnagyobb szállodájában laktam. Egy 20 szobás lakosztályban. Nekem elegen van egy Fél-Amerikát belőtt látni. A riporterek annyit zaklattak, hogy elhatároztuk, elköltözünk. New York 1000 kilométerre egy 16. századbeli kastélyt béreltünk ki, melynek minden kövét Franciaországból szállították ide. Mindegyik egy lakosztályban. Minden nap reggeli előtt 4 órát lovakolok.
Did you hear that? That male voice intrude? That's part of the editing as well. That's sound editing. That's János's voice intruding on her memories that she's experiencing as she reads the letter. Her imagination about the experience János is having are filtered through her own memories of youth and young adulthood. If you think about this, this is 1952, 1953. She would have been born in the mid to late 19th century. So as she reads these words about Janos in New York, hobnobbing with the rich and famous, you know, meeting European royalty and Eleanor Roosevelt and all these people, her imagination about it is not 1950s America. There's no James Dean or Marilyn Monroe there. It's all filtered through her own experience of youth. And we don't know if those scenes of the people in sort of turn of the century costume, when she might have been, let's say 30 or 40, are her memories or just her idea of what people hobnobbing should look like. And again, that's a very sort of expressionist type of editing that contrasts with the otherwise realism of the film. It's two clashes of style that work really well in the film, but also jar just a little bit. The other aspect of the film that I want to call attention to a little bit is its use of narrative gaps. Narrative gaps happen in films all the time, and by narrative gap, what I'm talking about is a moment in a film where it presents us with not all of the information, and now we have a gap because we know there's something, but we don't know everything. And what that does, it's a compelling part of storytelling, is it pushes the viewer to try to fill in the gap. And this is one of the ways that we engage with narrative. In mystery films, we know someone's been murdered. We have these 8 people. We don't know who did it. That's a gap. And part of what's compelling about watching or reading mysteries, for example, is how we try to fill in, I think she did it. No, it couldn't have been her because it must have been him, and so on. These are narrative gaps. There are lots of types of narrative gaps. Some are necessary. A character gets a phone call. Oh my God, it's an emergency. I'll be right there. Hangs up the phone. Now they're knocking on the door. There's a gap there. It might have taken 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour. We don't know. We'll find out eventually if it's important. And there are lots of ways that films do this. Some gaps call attention to themselves. That's the murder mystery. We know someone here did it. The movie's telling you there's a gap here. Try to figure it out. Some gaps don't call attention to themselves. You don't know there's a gap there. And when the gap is filled, you go back and go, oh. A great example, we go through the whole second half of Star Wars or more. Then we go through 3/4 of Empire Strikes Back, and then we get that famous moment, I am your father. There was a gap there. The film suppressed it. We didn't know there was a gap, but when we as viewers get to that moment, no way! And we go back and try to figure out, put those pieces together. And Luke does the same thing when he's hanging there at the bottom of Cloud City. He's like, Ben, why didn't you tell me? Right? Luke had the gap too, and so did we. Most films resolve most of their gaps. If they create a question in your mind as a viewer, you feel sort of cheated if they don't answer it, if it's important. But sometimes they don't. So we may never know, for example, what Bill Murray says to Scarlett Johansson at the end of Lost in Translation, right? So that's an open gap, but most of the times films close gaps. Love has narrative gaps all over the place. For the first 20 minutes or so, we don't actually know where Janos is. We don't know either of these stories. We know that Janos, the husband, son, is gone, but we don't know where he is. We don't know how much Najmaba believes Lutza's story. She's always questioning, is he really having a good time in America? When is he coming back? And those questions seem to have ulterior motives, like she's trying to get Lutza to tell her some greater truth. One gap that we never know an answer to is, why was Janos put in prison? We get a little flashback of the secret police arriving to take him away. And we get 2 comments in the film that it was about politics. But we don't know if he was falsely imprisoned. We don't know if he was some sort of anti-communist organizer. We don't know if he was one of the Communist Party sympathizers who fell out with them, a la A Diary for My Children. It's never answered. And that gap and others like it, again, reinforce the uncertainty of the film. And one of the things that Love is about is life under a totalitarian regime. And one of the things that happens in life under a totalitarian regime is that you never know what's going to happen. You never know when they're going to come for you, right? You never know how they're going to change the narrative. You never know when a leader is going to get up and say something dreadful and then the next day say, I didn't say that. This kind of uncertainty about reality is incorporated in these narrative gaps. There's a really simple one that I want to show you that conveys Lutz's situation clearly.
Tanárnő, kérem, fáradjon a tanáriba, igazgató elvtárs, kéreti.
Jó, mindjárt megyek.
Tegnap délelőtt törték rájuk az ajtót.
A villanyszámlás érezte meg a gázszagot.
Mind a négyen meghaltak?
Mind a négyen.
Összerúgta a port az igazgatójával.
És az egyik nővérét is kitelepítették.
Az is tanár volt. Fizika, kémia.
Fáradjon be, elvtársnő.
She gets called into the office, there's dread, and then as she goes in, we cut to later. And the film chooses not to show us what happened in that meeting. That is a narrative gap, what's happened to her. I want to talk a little bit about the end of the film to wrap up. If you don't want to hear how the film ends, then you can jump ahead to this time here, and that'll be the kind of wrap up of the video. Last chance. Lutza gets a letter saying that she can go and meet János in the prison. So we think we're finally going to meet him. And then we cut to the prison and János is being released. And this again is full of information gaps, narrative gaps, because on the one hand, it seems like he's being furloughed and that he has to return. But on the other hand, it seems like he's being released for good. And the way the film builds up to this moment is that it seems like this is what the letter was about, that Lutza was going to be able to go meet him, but she's not going to meet him. She's not there when he's released. She's not home when he gets home. And the last kind of 15 or 20 minutes of the film is János wondering where Lutza is. Another gap. And this creates a kind of anticipation and dread. And this starts to be reinforced in very clever ways at the end of the film by the cinematography. There are a lot of shots of halfway into a room through a doorway where we get kind of half the information, but not all of the information. And it ends in this stunning climax, and I am going to just show you, for those who are interested, in the last couple of minutes of the film, because this is where all the things I've talked about before, performance, editing, narrative gaps, come together in one of the most heart-rending, beautiful climaxes in a film that I've ever seen.
Anyám mikor halt meg?
Könnyű halála volt.
Hozzám tudsz megint szokni?
Szeretlek.
Right? I'm sure it has more emotional weight if you've sat through the whole film, and it goes on for a few more minutes, but you can see how the way it's shot with them looking at each other, but we only see one of them. That's a kind of visual gap when the film will use things outside the frame or when it uses blocking techniques to prevent us from getting all of the information. And there's also the filling in of the gap of where was Lutza? Why is János home? And then there's the completion of the gap of Lutza and János coming together, the thing that she's wanted so much. And also in their dialogue, the completion of the gap of Nagymama's story. And the whole thing is heartbreaking and beautiful. And it's a film about quiet perseverance driven by love in the face of an all-encompassing totalitarian regime that can do what it wants to grind these people down, but that can't stop them from loving each other or hoping for something better. It's a beautiful film and I highly recommend it. Second Run does a version of it. I mentioned them in previous Hungarian videos. There's also this really great Hungarian version, if you can get a hold of this. And what makes this special, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that one of Mak Károly's later films is called A Long Weekend in Pesten Buda, or in Hungarian, Egy hét Pesten és Budán. And what's interesting about this film is it's sort of a quasi-sequel made 30 years later. So there you get Ivan Darvas and Mari Tudacik here. It's a fantastic copy, and it also includes a whole disc of specials and interviews with English subtitles with Mak and other people involved with the films. If you've been watching any of my other videos and you've gotten anything out of them, I'd love it if you'd hit the subscribe button if that's something you feel like doing. But until next time, my name's Aaron Hunter. Thanks for watching.